From beanies to carry bags, and from shoes to caps, browse our shop now at tntradio.live. Navigating through the minefield of misinformation, intelligence operations, predictive programming. This is Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio for our second hour. Before we jump into our conversation with George Szamuely, I had a quick announcement to make on behalf of TNT Radio. For those listening, they probably know last December, Julian Assange's two-day public hearing was announced for February 20th and 21st at the UK High Court to determine whether Julian will have permission to appeal or whether he will be extradited to the United States. TNT will be at the Royal Courts of Justice broadcasting and covering the entire 2 days if required. Then TNT will broadcast from various locations throughout London, lighting the fuse for freedom. So that's just a very important thing to keep in mind and to keep focused on. With that in mind, I'm very, very happy to be joined by a geopolitical analyst extraordinaire who is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. He is a co-host of the Gaggle, a fantastic show with Peter Lavelle, and he's a frequent guest in RT and especially Crosstalk. So George Szamuely, thank you so much for coming on.
No, it's good to see you, Matt. And you must remember, you've been a guest of ours on the Gaggle and a very good guest. So thank you for that.
I was very honored. Thank you so much. So I figure we'll just have you come into my digital room now for
right,
a brief
and then
moment.
you'll come back with us. Yeah,
that was good. It'll be a great dance. So no, I mean, look, you're based in Budapest, Hungary. First question, I guess I got. We're just gonna we're as we discussed, we're gonna just improvise a little bit. I know you follow global events very well. You keep your finger on the pulse, so I'm pretty sure anything I throw at you, you're gonna have something interesting to say. One thing I noticed, there has been a little bit of pushback, some stalling from Orban in Hungary, more specifically, or the leadership at Hungary, on the issue of Sweden ratification into NATO. Do you see this going anywhere ultimately, or do you see that do you think that they're going to bend to the pressure? There's a lot of pressure, and also secondary question on that. We know that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. It's been cultivated and groomed for a long time by Western intelligence. I know that Finland and Sweden also have sort of Nazi skeletons in their deep history that are not supposed to be spoken about in polite society. Do you think that there is a danger of the Mannerheim, von Rosen fascist impulses of World War II within Finland and Sweden? Is there some dangerous kind of current that's similar to anything we see in let's say Ukraine right now?
I do think that. I think the link between pre-war Scandinavia, contemporary Scandinavia, and then pre-war, war, and then post-war Ukraine is Russophobia, a deep, abiding hatred of Russians, abiding hatred of Slavs, the belief that these are somehow Untermenschen, profoundly inferior people. And I do think that the way Europe has mobilized against Russia, and this predates the start of the so-called special military operation. I mean, it began really, I guess, around 2016, maybe 2017. I think at the time of the hysteria of Putin interfering in the Russian election, Putin interfering in the U.S. election, Putin interfering in the UK Brexit referendum. And that kind of mounted this hysteria, and Europe mobilized. You remember all the Skripals, that whole nonsense that Putin poisoned essentially a Russian traitor and so on. No evidence was presented. So it resembles very much the way Hitler mobilized Europe. I remember most people have forgotten that Hitler did mobilize Europe against the Soviet Union. Hitler didn't just invade by himself. He had allies. Admittedly, they were ineffective fighters mostly, but nonetheless, among the countries invading the USSR in 1941 was Finland, Hungary, France, Italy, you can just start listing these, a number of the Euro, now all NATO members in good standing. So what's happened now is a mobilization of Europe of the kind that Hitler could only dream. I mean, he wanted Europe, but he also to mobilize against the Soviet Union, but he wanted the United States and the United Kingdom to join forces. That didn't work out for him. It has worked out now, and then you have to really go back in history as to what is the origin of this European Russophobia, and why is it so easy to mobilize this hatred against Russia. But going back to your original question, ultimately I don't think Hungary's opposition to Sweden is going anywhere. I mean, there's a pattern with Orban. I mean, he's the bad boy in the classroom. He's always difficult. Whatever the issue comes up, whether it's immigration, whether LGBTQ issues, or he's always getting into fights with Brussels. And sometimes he gets away with it, sometimes he doesn't. There's always a point, like as with the bad boy in the classroom, when teacher gets fed up and says, well, you've got to do the homework, or you're going to have to go talk to the headmaster. And I think this is what happened when Orban was opposing the 50 billion euro handout to Ukraine. He went up to the brink, he went to Brussels, and then finally he caved. And I think something like this will happen in Sweden. Every single NATO member state is now ratified, including even Turkey. Only Hungary is the last holdout. I imagine it'll go on for a few more weeks, and then he'll finally cave. I mean, certainly Orban hasn't made any principled stand against Sweden's membership. I mean, you could. There are plenty of reasons why Sweden should be in NATO, but Orban's objection is exclusively that Sweden has been very nasty in its criticisms of Hungary, and say, well, if you want us to do you a favor, how about you do us a favor and stop criticizing us? But Sweden hasn't let up on its criticism. So, but eventually, I mean, there's just no real room for Orban. No one's going to give him anything. I mean, in the case of Erdogan, as you know, he had a price, and the United States was willing to pay that price, which is the 40 F-16 fighter jets. In the case of Hungary, no one's going to pay him anything. I think Hungary's just too small a player for anyone to bother too much with it.
Okay, so when Ursula von der Leyen was saying, like, we need to come up with a new mechanism to avoid having to deal with unanimity amongst all the member states of Europe, that's probably not necessarily as important in the mind of the Brusselites and the they could just smother within basically pressure and patience any dissenting voices in time, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. It's just that you're going to get it done more quickly. By insisting on unanimity, it just takes a little longer. I mean, they could have got Sweden into NATO more quickly if they didn't have this rule about unanimity. I mean, of course, that's a little different because according to the NATO charter, it has to be unanimous. But what they're doing in the EU is now, particularly Scholz and the rest, I mean, they're saying, well, let's have qualified majority voting so that we don't have to waste too much time on the likes of Orban, and to a lesser extent Fico. I mean, but Robert Fico of Slovakia, but he doesn't even put up the resistance that Orban does. So it's not such a huge deal. By and large, the EU member states fall into line pretty quickly. It's really always Orban who's just being the difficult boy.
Okay. So you touched on something I'd like to scratch on a little bit more. You mentioned that there's been this deep Russophobia embedded in the psyche of most Western people in Europe and America and Canada, where I live. At first, I was thinking, well, is this due to the effects of Cold War anti-communist propaganda that we were just subjected to for decades and decades? And then, no, not really. It can't just be that, because even before there was a communist revolution, there was still an anti-Russianism embedded in the psyche of so many people in Europe, even before communism was a thing. So what is your take? What are the core or some of the more important influences for where this comes from? Why does it arise?
Well, I really think it's a very interesting question. Back in the 19th century, Russia was seen as the bastion of reaction. And we've seen, this was empire, Orthodox Church, something even more primitive than feudalism, and it offended liberal sensibilities. The reason why that didn't really work out in the way that has worked out subsequently today is that with the emergence of Germany, other states suddenly thought that this is a more urgent problem. So, like if you were looking at history in, let's say, the late 19th century, and you think, well, who's the next war going to be against? You would say probably against the Russian Empire. It's the one everybody hates. But because of the rapid emergence of Germany towards the end of the 19th century and the fear that this inspired, suddenly that was all kind of forgotten, and suddenly Russia became a very useful ally against Germany, and rather disgustingly, they essentially used Russia as cannon fodder against Germany, very much against Russia's interests, but that was the plan, that they used Russia as cannon fodder. But then after World War One, I mean that's got to remember. I mean not Hitler. I mean Imperial Germany imposed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty after World War One, and while it's true that the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was cancelled at the Paris Peace Conference, nonetheless its actual principles, the actual points that there were in Brest-Litovsk were recognized by the Western powers. So everything that Germany did to Imperial Russia at Brest-Litovsk was then recognized as basically the accepted international borders of Russia. And if you then think about the alliances that were formed after the Paris Peace Conference, these were alliances directed at Imperial Russia. I mean, the alliances, all this, that the Little Entente was a Little Entente that was directed at Russia, and that's why Hitler's calculation was that he will be able to mobilize the continent against the Soviet Union. He didn't really see any problem in that because he assumed pretty much all of Europe would go along with it. He kind of bungled it, Britain behaved in an unpredictable way, and that didn't work out for him. But it's constantly there, and it's consistently, when you see right after World War II, the emergence of NATO. Again, the idea of NATO was that, oh well, we're so afraid of a Soviet Union, the Red Army marching on to the English Channel. But if that's the case, why are you bringing in countries that are nowhere near the Soviet Union? I mean, why is Portugal in NATO? I mean, Portugal was one of the earliest members of NATO. And so, already at such an early stage, you were mobilizing the continent against the Soviet Union. I mean, it was already bringing in all sorts of countries that couldn't possibly be afraid of anything from the Soviet Union, but you were already kind of forging a kind of incipient military alliance against Russia. And people said it at the time. I mean, NATO was by no means universally accepted when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in 1949. A lot of critics, like Walter Lippmann, who said, this is a really bad idea. You're essentially mobilizing a continent against the Soviet Union. They're going to feel threatened. There's no question. They're going to react to this, to essentially a threat. And this is always forgotten. NATO came first. The Warsaw Pact was not adopted till 1955, 6 years after the North Atlantic Treaty, and then only in response to Germany, West Germany, being inducted into NATO. I mean, it's no wonder that the felt threatened.
It's so important, this whole cause and effect thing, cause and reaction, because we've been given a framing of history to make it seem as though we have always been the good guys, the champions of liberty and justice and democracy against the big bad authoritarian personality types of Eurasia that have wanted to take over the world. And in fact, when you look at things like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well, like, yeah, that's evidence why Russia is like, fascist Nazis. Same thing. They were working on carving up the world together. And it's like, wait a minute. No, that actually happened after the Munich betrayal, not before. Hitler was trying to get, Stalin was working really hard to try to get some sort of mutual security pact to protect the interests, not just of Russia, but of everybody against Nazism. And the British were working hard. Lord Halifax and Chamberlain were saying, no. Let's just help. let's ignore you and help Nazism take over Czechoslovakia, take over Poland. And in fact, what you just said, that's a big mystery for a lot of people who don't know what you just said, which is that was always the point, was to rally everybody to, yeah. So that being said, we're going to scratch on this and pull on this after a quick commercial break when we come back on TNT Radio's Connecting the Dots, tntradio.live.
TNT's Misty Winston.
She says, how is anyone still talking about October 7th? What Israel has done since October 7th is many times worse than what happened on that day by any conceivable metric. The only way to feel otherwise is to believe Israeli lives are worth many times more than Palestinian lives. How is Israeli suffering still being centered over vastly less significant acts of violence 3 months ago, while exponentially worse violence and suffering is being inflicted by Israelis right this very moment? If your nation is attacked and you respond to that attack by immediately murdering thousands of children with incredible savagery, then you forfeit any right to expect anyone to give a shit that your nation was attacked. Israel responded to the Hamas attack by doing something much, much worse than anything Hamas has ever done, and in doing so, completely delegitimizing itself as a state and completely validating everything the Palestinian resistance has been saying about the state of Israel since day one.
Misty Winston on today's News Talk, TNT. The Net Zero Con will leave millions of citizens dependent on state handouts. It isn't a theory, it's an agenda. There is no climate emergency. On air 24/7. This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, I'm back for the second segment of the second hour on Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio, where I'm joined by George Szamuely. And we've been discussing the historic currents of our current problem. Where does this Russophobia come from? Was Russia at fault for so much of the things we were told they were at fault for, trying to take over the world as the commie supervillain world government that justified everything that the CIA did, everything that NATO did for 70 years, overthrowing governments, murdering leaders. I mean, I don't know how it's a long list. I don't know how long that list is, but it's a long list of governments that we overthrew in the name of democracy and liberty. Vietnam Wars, Cambodia, wars against terror, you name it, we did it. But it was had to be done. It had to be done, right? I mean, we were trying to stop the Kremlin from taking over the world, and they definitely wanted to do that, just like they do today, right? No, obviously this is facetiousness. We've been lied to. Today we've got a lot of a barrage. We've got Navalny. We're being told he's been murdered by authoritarian Nazi Putin, and Navalny, the peace-loving humanist, has been murdered. We've got Putin. Apparently, he's deploying nuclear missiles in space. That's something also the media, Newsweek, has been covering. All the mainstream media has been covering and amplifying that. There's a lot. We've been given a lot. Let me get your take on some of these current boogeyman stories that are being unveiled to scare the hell out of us. Navalny, first thing. What's your take on Navalny? Was he just murdered by his political enemies in the Kremlin?
I would doubt it, because I don't see what Russia would gain from the death of Navalny. And as we can see, it's actually a huge boost and a huge shot in the arm for the US and NATO. And they're all in attendance at the Munich Security Conference, and then they can all just reach for the nearest microphone and go on and on about the horrible tyrant, dictator, murderer, Putin, and how we must all resist Putin because of our values. We have our values. And So I don't see there's any benefit for Russia in all of this. I do think, though, that Russia should have looked after his health and welfare much more than they did so, because if anything happened to him, this was an inevitability that the West would finally get a propaganda shot in the arm. I mean, the West has had a hard time of it recently. There was obviously the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson, which has been a topic of extensive conversation. A lot of people expressed some admiration for Putin. Certainly humanized him and made him a very intelligent, sophisticated leader. Then, of course, now you've had the Ukrainian withdrawal from Avdiivka, which means finally the Russians have taken the city. So that's again a blow to the NATO propaganda campaign. So finally, they get NATO gets a shot in the arm. Hey, we told you what terrible person Putin is. And now they've got it. They can maybe rectify another problem for the West, which was that the United States seemed to be dragging its feet about sending the $60 billion for Ukraine. This will put pressure on the Republicans. The Republicans aren't that good at withstanding pressure, but now everyone's going to just pounce on them. Well, obviously, the Biden administration, but now, all of the Republicans who are war hawks and neocons. Now this will, energize them, and they're going to go right after, Speaker Mike Johnson, and particularly those obstreperous backbenchers like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. What are you doing? You're helping this horrible, murderous monster. So this I think might help getting this money to Ukraine. So everything that we've seen, it's a benefit to NATO. It doesn't do anything for Russia, which I think should just common sense would suggest Russia would gain nothing from the death of Navalny, and particularly as he was yesterday's man. I mean, leave aside the question of whether he deserved to be in prison for 19 years, which seems like a way excessive prison term, but there wasn't really much support for him in Russia. He's been sentenced to prison. No one seems to be terribly interested in his fate in Russia. He doesn't really command the following, even the limited following that he enjoyed 10 years ago. His campaigns against corruption, I think people have lost interest in that. There's a serious war going on, so corruption is just on the back burner. So there's no reason to get rid of Navalny. So again, if you go, I mean, of course, people are saying cui bono, somebody else may have killed him, but I haven't seen the evidence for that. But I certainly don't see any reason at all why Russia should have killed him.
Yeah, that sort of preempted my next thought, because I was just reading a military expert, Alexander Zimovsky, who was making a comment just on that point, where he was alluding to the idea that Western intelligence, Western agents operating inside of Russia killed him. And I was also hungry for some evidence of that, which is possible. Right. I'm very open to that.
Well, exactly.
As I'm very open to such,
Right.
Go on.
That's the thing. I mean, you say, yeah, cui bono. Okay, I can see that the West would gain a big propaganda boost from his death, but just because they gain doesn't mean that they actually did it. I mean, if there's evidence, I mean, I would imagine it would be quite hard to pull something like this off. I mean, they would have to go to this prison camp in the Arctic, but it's possible. I mean, you'd have to say, I mean, who knows? Look at the visitors logs. Has he had visitors in recent weeks? There may be. Yeah. I mean, he may well have entertained
throwing that out
over
there.
The past week.
Yeah, things to look at, things to look for.
Right.
Okay, so the other question regarding Navalny that I've seen come up is that people have called him an agent of influence of the MI6, of George Soros. Others have said he was a hero. Obviously, I think anybody listening kind of knows our position on this. That the popular image that was sold to a lot of young millennial Russians and people just who are basic media consumers in the West of him being this democracy anti-corruption fighter was highly oversimplified and just wrong. What do you think when people say he was an operative for Soros or MI6? Do you think that there's something to that?
Yeah, I do think there's something to that. I mean, he started his career as a kind of nationalist, populist figure, raising the sort of issues that nationalists and figures on the right in Russia raise, which is, hey, we're being inundated with migrants from the Caucasus, and that's still a constituency for people who do think that as they do in the United States, that hey, we're being displaced by uncontrolled migration, cheap labor, whether it's from the Caucasus or from other Central Asian states. So that he embarked on that early in his career, wasn't too successful at that. And then he kind of, he went to the United States and spent some time there at the Yale, got a Yale fellowship. And when he came back, he kind of reinvented himself as a liberal, with all standard liberal pieties. And then he became this anti-corruption crusader. Of course, then he got involved in various dishonest, fraudulent practices. But he was essentially kind of an opportunist. He was looking for the main chance. But there's, I think, clear evidence that money was being funneled to him by MI6. I mean, there's a video of one of his assistants meeting someone from MI6. They're discussing financing. So I don't think that's anything really one can argue about. Of course, he's being financed from abroad, and I think that's what undermined his position in Russia, because Russians were not going to support somebody who is clearly being funded, supported by MI6 and the CIA. He's obviously working for other countries' interests, not the interests of Russia. And I think Russians are really fed up with it. They had a belly full of those types of people during the 1990s. They weren't going to support somebody else like that. So he really had no, no support at all. I would imagine he got also very bad advice from his handlers to go back to Russia. Evidently, after the quote poisoning unquote, which itself was a very, very bizarre episode. But then he was again, if Russia wanted to kill him, that would have been the time to kill him. I mean, instead they allowed him to be flown out to Germany. He received medical treatment in Germany. And then after he had received the medical treatment, he then went back to Russia. And I assume the reason that they sent him back into Russia was they thought that he would now galvanize an anti-Putin mass movement, and that didn't materialize. But the obvious thing was clear that if Russia wanted him dead, and he suddenly had that collapse at the airport that I think it was at Tomsk, I think either Tomsk or Omsk airport, that would have been the time. Take him into hospital, and then lo and behold, it did. Instead, Russia went to a lot of trouble for him to be flown out to Germany, even though they had to have known that what's going to happen is the Germans are going to say, yes, we have evidence that he was poisoned by Novichok. Yes, let's see the evidence. Well, we can't. It's the evidence is top secret, highly secret. We've shown it only to the OPCW. And then the Russians went to the OPCW. Can we see the evidence? No. You have to go to the German government. They'll give you the evidence. So they're never really shown any of this evidence of this Novichok poisoning.
Yeah, no, I'd completely forgotten about that case of how much work they went through to keep him alive in the first place. That's a wonderful. I'm going to be using that a lot. Thank you for reminding me of this. And it's true, like to think that, but they wouldn't do that. Well, Skripal, who saw the evidence? Who has seen the evidence of what we were told?
Where is Skripal?
Yeah, where's him and his poor daughter? Where do they go? I mean, we could hear of nothing but them for like every single day for a month, and then now they're gone. Like what's going? And Berezovsky, like frankly, okay, he's kicked out. He's a non-factor politically, and all of a sudden he like dies in Britain. Right. Was he maybe suicide. More valuable?
Very convenient suicide. Yes.
Yeah, suicide. Exactly. I mean, it doesn't pay to be a traitor these days, loyal to a financier oligarchy, because sometimes you might find yourself more valuable dead and alive, because then you create the basis of a new narrative that will be more just geopolitically expedient for those who are handling you when you're dead.
Right.
So don't be a traitor. That's the lesson of this story. um, on the
Right. Yeah,
issue
no,
of,
you get punished. I remember once, I think Putin was asked about Skripal at the time of the Skripal hysteria, and he asked something like, well, did you kill Skripal? And he said something, along the lines of, why are we wasting time talking about a traitorous scumbag? He's not worth our even spending 10 seconds discussing him. That's the view, I think, of Russians. He's a traitor. He's a lowlife. So therefore, he just there's nothing to discuss. And again, even the way the media presented Skripal as if he's a dissident, but it's not really a dissident. I mean, he was a traitor. He betrayed his country. I mean, it's like saying Kim Philby was a dissident. No, I mean, he was a traitor. He betrayed his country, he betrayed his friends, his colleagues, and everybody. So he doesn't deserve any kind of respect as a dissident, someone who stood up against the big man.
yeah, he's a non-entity. There was also, what's the name of that figure whose name is escaping me, who was like an insignificant member of the Duma and who got shot somewhere like near the Kremlin.
Nick, what's his name?
Ah, bugging me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His name escapes me. I know
So many
exactly what you mean.
so many disposable cutouts
Right,
are
right.
out there. So don't be a
Yes,
disposable cutout.
that's right. Yeah.
The lesson is be a mensch, don't be a cutout. On the issue of, so the other thing that we're getting a lot in the media, I alluded to it, is the Putin is trying to put nuclear weapons in space in preparation for an oncoming attack against the free and democratic Western liberal world order, because that's what they do. That's what you do if you're an authoritarian like Putin. Is you want to destroy everybody around you because you just hate freedom. So nuclear weapons in space, that's the new thing. What's your take on that? Does Putin have it? Is there any evidence that Putin wants to put nuclear weapons in space?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if they did that, they would somehow be in violation of the outer space treaty, that which they signed in, I think, 1967. However, there is a real problem that these things in space, these satellites, the United States is using these satellites to help Ukraine. I mean, they're using this as, essentially, this is gathering intelligence about Russian military formation, Russian military targets, and it is transmitting this information to Ukraine and enabling Ukraine then to attack Russians and destroy Russian targets. So if you think of these satellites, they seem to me to be legitimate military targets. I mean, whether nuclear weapons is the best way to hit them, but nonetheless, it's hard for the United States to argue that these satellites are not legitimate military targets. If you're using them in a war, you're using them in order to kill Russians, then they are legitimate military targets. And if at some point Russians really get fed up with what NATO has been doing in Ukraine, then this would be a natural first target for Russia to attack, rather than say attack Latvia or Poland or anything, because that's NATO territory, and you don't know how NATO would respond to an attack on NATO territory. But this, hitting satellites, you say, well, okay, I mean, you're using them, these are weapons, you're using these weapons against us. It's not NATO territory. I mean, you can't call outer space NATO territory. We can, knock you out. And I think that Russia is, I think, sending a message saying at some point we may well hit these satellites because they are legitimate military targets. You're using them against us, and we're kind of getting a little tired of it. So again, I don't know if nuclear weapons are the most effective way of hitting them, but I think they definitely are legitimate military targets. I don't know, when you are in outer space, whether you have any kind of geographic delimitations. Well, that's territory and that territory. I think it's, once it's out there, you can just hit it.
Yeah, I think that's probably where it falls in the legal discussion. All right, before we continue this conversation, where we have a lot of things to still continue to pull on, we're going to go for a quick commercial break on TNTRadio.live, and we'll come right back for more.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
I really don't understand how this trial between Michael Mann and Mark Stein is continuing. And I don't know if Dr. Mann wanted to put his hockey stick on trial. There are so many holes in his argument. It is hard to believe. I don't even understand how people could have let that out without questioning it. And I've talked about this before. One of the biggest problems I have is he won't let anyone look at his data, at least no one that is skeptical of his data, and that should raise red flags. Now, I've talked about this many times. You can go and look at what the global temperature does. When it's warm in the eastern and central part of the United States and warm across Europe, usually the global temperature is elevated. Now, when it's cold in those areas, believe it or not, the global temperature is actually colder. The problem with his whole hockey stick and the recreation of temperatures from pine cones is the areas he looks at and draws his ideas from are usually cold when the earth is warm. So he would not be able to detect that. He would not know that because he's not a meteorologist. If he was a meteorologist, would he know it? Of course he'd know it, because we talk about this all the time. They're called teleconnections. So if I were in there talking about this, I'd be asking, where is your meteorology background and are you aware of this going on? But in any case, this whole hockey stick idea of temperature recreation looks to be more of a hokey stick to a lot of us out there. And the first red flag is you wouldn't let anyone look at your data. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
When the world's endangered animals need help most, when their lives are at greatest risk, when they would otherwise be lost, the International Fund for Animal Welfare is there, taking action to rescue the animals we love, to protect them and their threatened natural habitats. See how you can help animals and people thrive together at joinifall.org.
Navigating through the minefield of misinformation, intelligence operations, predictive programming. This is Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
All right, welcome back to the third segment of the second hour on Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio. We have been talking a lot about just how to think through the loud noise of misinformation, disinformation that we're being subjected to. And I'm not talking about the conspiracy theories that Klaus Schwab and Ursula von der Leyen warn about that we need to, protect citizens from. I'm talking about all of the messaging that is weaponizing us to prepare for war with either Russia and or China or some combination of the two, based on the fact that our liberal world order is being threatened by authoritarians. Sounds a lot like the sort of rhetoric we heard throughout the entirety of the Cold War just being revived. On the issue of Putin's recent discussion with Tucker Carlson, I had just read that up to 1 billion views or 1 billion people have watched this. I don't know if that means that one person's watched it, 3 or 4 times. I don't know how you count that sort of thing, but that's all. There's a lot of people in this world who have watched Putin speak for 2 hours, throwing an immense amount of truth bombs in the course of this conversation. Do you think that this has completely shattered the years of psychological walls that have been built up to weaponize us against Russia, or do you think it's just cracked them? What sort of effect do you think that this interview has had on breaking or at least derailing the war momentum that's been planned against Russia?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think whatever positive momentum that was built up following that interview, I think has been now shattered with this news about Navalny, and Tucker Carlson himself has come out very harshly about what happened to Navalny. And then, Putin himself kind of gave a very odd interview a couple of days ago with a Russian journalist in which he expressed disappointment in the interview. He said something like, well, you know, this American journalist, he didn't push me enough. He didn't challenge me enough. And you know, I was really, I'd have preferred a more challenging interview, which seemed a little, I think, unfair to Tucker, because I think Tucker went in, you know, with a view to essentially giving Putin a platform. And I, to be honest, I didn't think Putin made the best use of the time that Tucker gave him. I don't think you start off an interview with a long historical digression about what happened in the 8th century, because I think, you know, people who tuned into that interview, you know, they're raring to go. I think they're naturally sympathetic to Russia's position, and the first question that Tucker asked was well, why did you do it? Why did you launch your so-called special military operation? What was it that you saw then that, you know, posed such an immediate threat to you that you had to act? And I think that was an excellent question. And Putin ducked it by going into this long digression. So, and then I looked over his speech on February the 24th of 2022, and indeed, most of that speech is given over to talking about NATO, the threat from NATO, the expansion of NATO, the use of Ukraine as a kind of battering ram against Russia. And several times in that speech, he brought up Barbarossa, June the 22nd, 1941. We can't allow that to happen again. So he saw an immediate existential threat facing Russia then on you know, and that, you know, we can't allow another June the 22nd. But instead of going back to that and say, yeah, that was what we were thinking. That's the threat that we face, and we can't allow that threat. Instead, he just went off onto this historical digression and made it seem as if the issue is between Russia and Ukraine. Well, that's not what he said in that February national address. He said the issue is NATO. NATO is using Ukraine against us, and I think that's a correct analysis. But instead, by going on about the 8th century, it's made it seem as if this is some kind of a historic dispute between Russia and Ukraine. So that's very different from what he was saying back then. And I think that's, you know, and I think the people who are watching were expecting him to really bring up NATO, everything that NATO has done, and why NATO is such a threat to Russia. And that's why I don't think he made the best use of that time that Tucker gave him.
Yeah. No, and I share your concern as well, that it seems like so much of the potency as well of that having gone so viral has really been reduced by virtue of just the noise and amplification of Navalny's death, which has now sort of undermined a lot of that motion for a lot of people, unfortunately. But still, despite all of that, Ukraine just suffered some serious defeats again. They've had to do a massive retreat at a very embarrassing moment as well during the Munich Security Conference. I know that there's a weird security pact as well that France and Germany signed with Ukraine. So I guess multitude of questions here. What do you think is coming next, as far as will this continue on the way it is? What is the security pact that was signed between France and Germany, who are already self-sabotaging so badly on every level you could possibly imagine? They're being destroyed, and they're being told to destroy themselves even more by enmeshing themselves even greater in a war which is obviously unwinnable. And Zelensky is just completely dangling in the wind at this point. It doesn't seem like Tucker was clear that, and I think he represents a big a major voice within the establishment that you know, the Crimea, Eastern Donbass, all these territories are not going to come back to the possession of Kiev. If anything, Poland might grow a little bit, maybe Hungary might grow a little bit, who knows? But where do you see this going next?
Well, I tend to think that the withdrawal from Avdiivka is consistent with, I think, a change of strategy on Ukraine's part. I think they're just going to dig in. I think they're going to dig mines, dig trenches, lay mines, build all their fortifications, do what Russia did. And essentially, there'll be kind of a de facto line of separation between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine is going to be launching any more of these deadly offensives. And in the meantime, I think Ukraine is going to use this breathing space to build up its forces again. And I think that's why they're signing these agreements with France, with Germany. They've already signed it with the UK. I mean, they have an obvious one with the United States. In other words, they're going to just simply have a kind of de facto partition, or a separation of forces in Ukraine. There won't be any kind of a peace agreement. I don't think there'll be any kind of negotiations. I don't think there'll be any kind of an armistice. But I think the fighting will go on at a lower level. The question then is, well, what happens then? And I've suspected that when the next NATO summit takes place, the July summit in Washington, which will be the 75th birthday party for NATO, that NATO is going to bring Ukraine into its club. Now you could say, yeah, but there's still a war going on, and it's de facto occupied by someone else, and that violates NATO's own rules about bringing in new members. But I think they'll probably try to fudge it and say that, well, that's the way we did it with Germany. We kind of inducted West Germany into NATO, and West Germany kind of claimed that it spoke for all of Germany. So when you bring in West Germany, then in effect you're bringing in all of Germany, even if de facto you're not bringing in Germany because there's an East German state. But eventually, West Germany did indeed speak for all of Germany, and German reunification was Germany under the rule of West Germany, and the whole of Germany was then inducted into NATO. So I think they're going to think along those lines. I mean, the analogy isn't quite exact because there was no fighting within Germany between West and East Germany. So I think that they're going to try and do it. I don't know if they'll succeed, and I think it's a high risk strategy for them to do it. But if I were the Russians, I mean, I wouldn't simply accept any kind of a de facto separation of forces. I mean, I would try to push on and take as much territory as possible, because NATO might just present you with a fait accompli next July, and then you're going to have a problem on your hands. Like, you have to decide, what are you going to do? Because Russia is very, very, very reluctant to get into any kind of a shooting war with NATO. So whatever you're going to do, you better do it now, and don't wait for July summit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that's the thing. I don't think that there's a single case of a country being inducted while they were at war with another country outside of NATO. That is a weird one to think about. And yeah,
It is. I agree. It's very weird. On the other hand, I find it hard to believe that they're going to do another Vilnius. Remember, there was a lot of bad publicity for NATO after the Vilnius summit, when again they just fobbed Ukraine off with promises of eventual NATO membership. They have to do something more this time.
Right.
And I mean, yes, it's very weird to think NATO would be at war within itself on its own territory. But NATO has violated a lot of its rules so far.
Yeah.
NATO's
That's my
very good
mistake.
at violating
I
the
hear you.
rules.
And my mistake is I think I'm imposing rationality.
Exactly.
I'm projecting rationality onto something which is not animated by that.
Right.
That's my first error that I think I'm making right now. That's causing me a bit of cognitive dissonance there. So with the during a recent speech or an interview, Putin endorsed Biden. Basically said that Biden for president would be would create a much more stable situation. He's much more predictable. What do you think? Do you think that that he's helping Biden, or is he was he making an error, or was it a brilliant statement? What's your take on that?
I am a little baffled by it. And, the only explanation that I could come up with was that he thought that he would damage Biden by saying, he's my boy, he's my preference. Because I think they remember what happened in 2016 when it seemed like they wanted Trump to win, because I mean, I think the Russians saw Trump as being an outsider. He's going to come with a different set of ideas. He's a businessman. He's a pragmatic figure. He's not part of the whole Washington foreign policy making elite. So he's going to take another look at the U.S.-Russia relations. I think they were quite enthusiastic about. I mean, I don't think they interfered in the election. I think that's nonsense. But I think they looked positively on Trump. And I remember when Obama expelled all those diplomats because of the alleged interference in the 2016 election, and then there was that moment everyone was expecting that well, now Russia will expel American diplomats, all within a few days of Trump becoming inaugurated as president. So this will happily destroy U.S.-Russia relations. And how did Russia respond? They said, no, we're not going to do tit for tat. We're going to, in the spirit that we're going to turn up the other cheek, we won't expel any U.S. diplomats. And what happened then is, of course, then Obama and Biden interpreted that, we were right. There is collaboration between Trump and Putin, because it's never happened that Russia has not reciprocated and thrown out our diplomats. Therefore, that's evidence for Trump-Putin collusion. So I think that Biden, that Putin was thinking, well, I'm not going to do anything like, we like Trump. We said, yeah, my man is Biden. I find it hard to believe that he thinks highly of Biden at all. I mean, after everything that Biden has done, this war in Ukraine and everything, that he actually thinks, oh, he's a good person. He's predictable. He's a politician of the old school. It's just, I think it's just done, with a view to hurting Biden.
No, I think I'm very sympathetic with your analysis as well, and I kind of appreciated a few of the subtle, very diplomatic but little subtle jabs, like saying, of course, he bumped his head a few times when he visited, but who hasn't bumped their head?
Hasn't bumped his
head down? But ever fallen asleep? But who hasn't fallen asleep now and again?
Right,
I get tired. And...
Yes, he was sitting there reading from his notes. But I read from my notes as well. I've never seen him read from his notes. I mean, he always speaks. I've never seen him look down at notes. Yeah, but I read from notes as well.
Well, that's the beauty, is I think he's playing. He has this sense of humor, and I think one thing about technocrats is that they don't have a sense of humor. These liberal technocrats are so rigid and literalist that they don't know how to like see a satire. They just can't see a joke. And so it's a great way to screw with their heads. It's just to use some irony, some little sarcasm, and it's wonderful.
No, I agree. He has a very subtle sense of humor. It's like, because his face is quite impassive, so you don't quite notice that he's actually said something rather amusing. And so, yes, he was kind of really damning Biden with faint praise. And then, of course, the next day, Biden, came out with that whole harangue about Navalny and Putin and how evil he is. You could see, here he is being kind of subtly diplomatic about Biden, and then Biden is just ranting and raving about Putin.
Yeah, right. It's quite an interesting little piece of, anyway. It's good. So as we roll out towards the end of this conversation, what would be a sane pathway if the West is fit to survive? If and that's a big if the West is fit to survive, what would be a sane, possible, viable pathway to move into a world that has a future that doesn't involve us self-imploding and maybe unleashing some new World War I chain of reactions that involve nuclear weapons? So what do you think of as a sane approach that needs to be revived if, let's say, we get a Trump presidency again? Let's say, possible. What would you like to see?
Well, I would like to see some form of a revived Helsinki kind of peace conference. So something, that what they did in 1975, where all of the protagonists of the Cold War, the West and East, came and essentially recognized one another's territories, recognized that they had different governments, that they weren't going to try and knock over one another's governments, and that they were all going to be committed to peace and stability for the future. No one's going to try and enhance his own security at the other's expense. I think that was a historic breakthrough. I'd like to see something like that. I think Trump may be the person to do it. I mean, Trump is the kind of imaginative figure, and he might say, hey, rather than just make it all about Russia and Ukraine, let's put the Russia-Ukraine conflict within the context of a global security conference.
Absolutely. Adults in the room. We need some adults in the room. George Szamuely, anybody who wants to listen to you, go to the Gaggle on